Welcome, Jerry.
Thank you, Adam. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. And most people don't know, but you have a lot of history with Fortune conferences, in particular one special Fortune Global Forum. Can you just tell everybody briefly?
I was trying to remember how we got here today.
Yeah.
And I think that conversation started in Guangzhou last December when Fortune had the Global Forum there, which was a result of a re-invitation from John Needham because I think the forum was in Shanghai in 1997. Which was my first. And so there was a bit of this context of 20 years of not only doing Fortune Global Forums, but also just looking at the changes in internet and changes in China. I ran into a young man here. He asked me, I saw you in Guangzhou. Are you just following Fortune around? And I thought Fortune was following me around, but I now understand the error in my ways.
Well, and the Global Forum attendance that you made preceded your Yahoo's investment in Alibaba, which was kind of a good investment. And so these things can happen to all of you too by coming to Fortune conferences. I want to start rather than at the beginning, at the end, Jerry. You started a venture firm, I want you to remind me how many years ago, called Ame Cloud Ventures. Tell everybody what it is and what you've been up to.
So I left Yahoo in 2012, and my wife only had one rule for me, is just don't go to start another company. And
it's a fair request.
Yeah, and after 3 days at the house, and she figured out that I had nothing to do, and the honey-do list became rather long. I decided to go and get an office and actually do something I really wanted to do. And I started trying to do at Yahoo. And the end of 2011, early 2012, it's very different now. I think a lot of founders or executives of companies weren't really allowed to invest outside the company because of conflicts and things like that. Things have changed in that regard, Adam. But
that's interesting.
Well, not really. You can, but
no, it is. It is.
So I felt like I really missed being close to entrepreneurs at the beginning, people who were really building companies from the beginning, and this was just in the beginning of cloud and big data and sort of the mobility cloud trend that Pat and others have talked about earlier in the day, and you could feel it in the air. So I decided to go and take some of my own money, recruit 3 much younger guys who can go to all the parties and do all this stuff, and started really looking at sort of not only companies at the early stages, but also companies that have deep tech or deep science, which meant it was really not in the realm of what Yahoo did. There were some commerce companies, but I think by and large there were no media companies and there were no consumer internet companies, and part of it was just this desire to get back into tech again, get back into deep tech again, and I've been having a lot of fun ever since.
I asked Jerry to think of 3 of his portfolio companies as a way of illustrating to you all the way he's spending his time and the things that he's thinking about, and we're going to touch on all the most important trends: AI, quantum computing, and really cool stuff. So start with Capella.
Yeah, you asked me, and I think probably the most surprising thing for me when I started in 2012 versus where I am now is we have quite a bit of our portfolio companies, especially in the last 2 or 3 years, around sort of the intersection of life science and IT. And it's broadly speaking biology and digital. It goes across devices, it goes across therapeutics, it goes across diagnostics, things like that. And the one example I raised, which I think is interesting, there's actually 3 companies in that space, but the 2 that come to mind, one is Capella Biosciences, and Capella takes previously approved compounds by the FDA, that known toxicity, and just didn't quite work, and use ML, machine learning, and AI algorithms to be able to increase the search space, to be able to match it against other biomarkers. And so rather than doing these drug discovery in test tubes, they're doing it through massive simulation and massive algorithms. Another one is called Recursion Pharma, which is in Salt Lake, and they're doing it for rare diseases. And what's happening is clearly the advantage and the disruptiveness of technology, whether it's automation, robotics, in Recursion's case, it's AI, ML through vision. It really is speeding up and parallel processing the drug discovery process by orders of magnitude. And the hope is that even with compounds with known characteristics or compounds that are close from before, with the advent of things like precision medicine, we are really going to be able to have drugs that might work for 20% of the population. And that's a trend that I think is really not, this is a trend we saw 3 or 4 years ago, and now I think is becoming more and more the mainstream.
And Jerry, do you, at least twice in your career, starting Yahoo and investing in Alibaba, you had very good timing. As an investor, do you think about timing? I asked Tony Reed earlier, where are we in the maturity of AI? Do you feel like you can do that, or you just have to take a shot?
I think I've always thought myself as the luckiest person in the world, because my timing was starting Yahoo and timing investing in Alibaba, which really is the beginning of the Chinese internet. And I think time will tell. I think I'm a terrible venture investor. Well,
let's end this interview right now. We really don't.
Well, yeah, right, exactly. And part of it is I feel like my job is to be able to identify, or at least come up with things that are, on the one hand, could be huge markets like biology and digital. But on the other hand, can't be too early. It can't be science experiments. And so we'll see, Adam. But I feel like we're on this advent of, Pat Gelsinger called this superpowers. And I just think that it is a trend that if I'm off by 5 years, it's okay, it's my own money, right?
Yep.
Whereas I think venture funds and other sort of more professional investment entities have to time it slightly better.
Well, I think what's interesting about your career and this moment in your career, if you'll allow me, is that you were a PhD candidate. You told me a funny story about calling your mother to tell her that you were dropping out of the PhD program. Right. She was unhappy with you. She's okay now.
Yeah, she's okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Is that you have a commercial aspect to your career. You have a scientific aspect to your career. Tell everybody about what is quantum computing, and talk about this company you've invested in.
No. I can't tell you what quantum computing is.
Very briefly.
All I know is, and this goes to the point of timing, because growing up, building a quantum computer was not for venture. It just, there was, and this is also true for commercialization of space, and we invested in a bunch of space startups. I mean, to come to me even 5 or 6 years ago when we started this venture outfit to say, you're going to be investing in quantum computing, you're going to be investing in space, I would have thought you're crazy. And the environment of miniaturization and the leveraging of all this great infrastructure that has come in from generations before us are now making this possible. And the company, there are many people doing quantum computers, but the one we invested in is called Rigetti. And Rigetti is founded by Chad Rigetti. And Chad believes he will have 100 qubits within the next 12 months. I don't know exactly, he may be more public about that. Which at 100 qubits is, assuming it's error corrected and all this other technical aspect of it, would be more powerful than any other, more powerful than sort of the computing that's possible with bits and bytes, with ones and zeros. Now, programming quantum computers are difficult. Quantum computers are not necessarily deterministic. You have to operate at an environment that's near 0 Kelvin, so you have these very, 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 very cold refrigerators. But if you can get it to work, the possibilities of simulating molecules as chemical reactions are happening, doing large amounts of machine learning, being able to really see through some of the darkest or some of the hardest mysteries in science, it becomes possible. So this notion of quantum supremacy, the day that the computing from quantum computers surpasses that of sort of von Neumann architecture, is within, call it within 5 years, maybe 10 years, maybe sooner, is really, really remarkable. And it's not something that grew up as a computer geek. I just never thought we would see today.
And when you invest in a company like that, there's no economics for the time being, is that correct?
Well, the moonshots are, when you're shooting at the moon, there are usually not a lot of economics. But I mean, I think that with Rigetti and some of these other really ambitious hardware plays, the idea is that, because now with the advent of cloud, you can imagine there's a cloud service. So it used to be that you have to build these computers and have to sell it to you, and then you have to install it, and then God knows how are you going to keep the thing cool. Now you can set it up as a cloud server, and you just have to be able to get the mass amount of data into the cloud and then get it back, but you're just running a job.
So bonus investment to show everybody the breadth of what you're paying attention to these days. Tell them about Zipline.
I had told Adam Zipline, and how many of you guys have heard of Zipline? Okay, yeah, maybe it is passé.
See what I mean?
Yeah, he said it was passé. I was with the founder
I didn't say passé.
Yeah, it's old news. I know, Adam said it's old news. I was with founder last night, Keller, and this goes back to sort of, how do you pick investments? And Keller is a Stanford grad, and when I met him, he was building toy robots, and he said, you know what, I want to pivot, which is like the death nail for entrepreneurs, recap, and want to build drones that deliver delivery drones, and he has now a fixed wing delivery drone, basically, airplanes that have fixed wings, that are not these quadcopters, that flies 80-kilometer range, like 100, a couple hundred kilometers an hour. And he will have 2 distribution centers in the country of Rwanda in Africa that serves the entire country for emergency medical supplies. And if you go online, you go look up Zipline. It has videos of mothers. A lot of the blood that is needed in these remote places in Rwanda are from postpartum. Postmortem, you don't need blood anymore. Postpartum conditions, and people just speak from the heart. He's saving lives every day. He flies a couple thousand missions every day, and he has this. His office is in the ranch in Half Moon Bay, where he does flights after flights with cows and everything, and they're dropping packages on a parachute, and the whole thing is is AI, is auto navigation, is navigation by through vision, and it's just incredible what an entrepreneur with a will, and he's in Rwanda 2 weeks a month, and it's incredible.
Very neat.
So I would say that betting on entrepreneur ultimately is the differentiator, and
perfect segue. Many years ago, you bet on an entrepreneur named Jack Ma.
Yeah.
You were at Yahoo. Yahoo invested in Alibaba. You then had a front row seat for the next 20 years of the Chinese internet industry. Just very briefly describe to us what you've seen over that period of time, and we'll talk a little bit about where it stands now.
Sure. Well, and
you're on the board. You remain on the board of Alibaba.
I am, and I know there's going to be a panel tomorrow with quite a number of experts in this field, people I look up to talk about China, and clearly it's still a very dynamic environment. But I think China has gone through, a few phases where in the early 2000s, late 90s, they were seeing the internet as a jumping off point, and I would say through much of the 2000s there was this idea that Chinese companies were just going to copycat Western companies, and not just copycatting, but literally copying every pixel on pages, and so that I think the West, by definition, kind of ignored that, kind of looked at China and said, well, they're just going to copy, they're never going to innovate. And what happened, I think, is that copycat applied against a very relentless, almost cutthroat market environment in China, developed these entrepreneurs. So Jack is obviously the example we can talk about, and I know well, but this is true for your other subject in your column with Pony. This is true with Robin.
Pony of Tencent.
This is true with William Ding. So there is a group of entrepreneurs that grew up in the early 2000s that that used to hang out together, that still hang out together. Lei Jun from Xiaomi, Kingsoft. So these are battle-tested entrepreneurs through just cutthroat, and copying was a way to get them to start learning, rather than an end in itself. And I think that's something that we've seen. And then of course after I think 2010, 2011, you're starting to see business models develop in China that are entirely different from the West.
Yeah.
And I think it's part of that outgrowth of what happened in the 2000s. I mean, I think with Jack, you know, I said I was the luckiest man alive, and many of you know the story, but when I went to China the first time, he was my tour guide, sent by the Ministry of Foreign Investment, probably to keep an eye on me, but also, and so, you know, I feel like in retrospect, you know, what are the chances? Maybe he hosted a lot of people, I don't know, but it's one of those things where you just can't make this stuff up, and you can't imagine you would meet the future entrepreneur in Jack. But he was very curious. He was very, he clearly saw this ministry position as sort of a parking spot for himself in between startups. And then I had lost touch with him for a few years, and we were, Yahoo were struggling in China to try to, and we were losing our commerce efforts to this company called Taobao, and of course I found out it was Jack, and so having been competed against them, having realized how difficult the China market was going to be, a lot of people says, "Wow, you must have had a lot of insights, impressions, and great investing." I always say that when you can't beat them, you join them, and that's really the reason we ended up just saying, "Hey, how do we leave a large bet behind China as we exit?" Because it was clear that it was not going to be easy for a Western company to operate.
You mentioned a moment ago that Chinese internet companies are now doing business model innovation that is completely different and unique from what's happening elsewhere in the world. What's your favorite example of that?
Well, you know, if you take the the list goes on, because if you take Alibaba as an example, many Western analysts looked at it and said it was sort of the Amazon of China. But if you spend time there, you go to Hangzhou, you just listen to Daniel and other executives talk about it.
Current CEO of Alibaba.
CEO of Alibaba. Mm-hmm. There is a superficial resemblance, but inside is very different. You go to Didi and everybody says, well, it's the Uber of China. But the way they are dealing with volume, the way they're dealing with local transportation, the way they're partnering with local government on traffic control, I don't want to say it's Uber and more because it's Uber and different. Meituan, people say it's Groupon. I mean, Wang Xing started, copied Groupon, and today it is nothing like Groupon. And of course, Pony and what's going on at Tencent, is it Facebook of China? And those of you, and there's an endless number of articles written that it's nothing like Facebook. So I don't, and being American and being here, I don't say it's better over there. It's just very different because of the needs and the local market conditions that it's very cutthroat, and there's no sort of high moral ground competition. This feels like sort of Mad Max in the Thunderdome.
You're saying, yeah.
Two ideas go in, three go in, one come out kind of thing. So, yeah.
And you're saying they make the sort of Silicon Valley frenemy behavior sort of seem genteel by comparison, right?
I don't know. Well, I mean, I think the market is growing tremendously still in China, especially on digital. I mean, I don't know about the physical part. So there's still a lot of rising tide kind of floats all boat kind of thing going on. So, but I think as startups, it is very intense, and they all work crazy amount of time.
Yeah.
They have a culture that, when you go to work, you're with family. Yep. And when you have to go home, you're with your other family, but that's not as important as the work.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Jerry, before bringing in an audience, I want to end on this very high-level topic, which is the internet, or more precisely, the World Wide Web. For such a young man, you were practically present at the creation.
Oh, God.
And I'd just like you, given what Yahoo went through and all the experiences you had, where are we right now in the internet and the World Wide Web? Where are we going?
Well, I think, I think the World Wide Web was started by Sir Tim Berners-Lee in 1989. So we're coming up on 30 years, which is hard to imagine. And And clearly, the web started out as an open and accessible and sort of a very democratizing medium for information. And I think today we could probably say that we've gone to the pendulum swung the other way, which is the internet and the web is very fragmented. We were fragmenting along sort of mobile platforms, we're fragmenting along national sovereign boundaries with everybody essentially erecting more and more regulations around their own internet and around data. And we're quite frankly fragmenting along sort of large, huge mega company lines. You know, the Facebooks and the Googles and Amazons have more users than, obviously, than countries, and they have their own rules. And so I make that as an observation. I don't know if it's good or bad. Obviously, I think part of that is because the internet is now mainstream, where when we started in 1994 and 1995, it was kind of pushed off to the side. And now, as my examples have shown around the venture investing we're doing, there is not one single industry that's not going to get touched by the digitization, automation, and all the trends you've been talking about. And I think that's exciting, but also it brings on, I think, tremendous challenges with regards to, the future, especially as AI takes hold. So we're in this incredibly exciting time, but I also think we should make sure that we understand from the past that, that what got us here is that openness and accessibility of information and internet that seems to be going the other way right now. But I hope things will, I always hope the pendulum will swing back the other way at some point.
Super interesting. Your questions. Who would like to start?
I know I'm between you and dinner, so.
There's one way in the back. Let's get a mic to you, and just stand up and tell us your name, please.
Nathan Rosenberg from Insigniam. Jerry, I'm interested, given you brought up the birth of the internet, given the role that DARPA played in the creation of the internet, and now employees at Google don't want to support defense work, what's your point? And I know what Adam's point of view is, which was different than Alan's point of view. What's your sense about the tech industry's in the United States obligation to support the defense of the country?
So what was Alan's?
Well,
where's Alan?
The way Nathan framed it.
I want to keep writing the fortune.
Well, the way he framed it was very broad. If you don't mind, I'll paraphrase, which is, are these employees right that their companies should act politically and stay away from situations where they're selling technology to government agencies whose policies they disagree with, or should they suck it up and we got to make money here and it's our government after all? Fair, Nathan, is that good? Okay.
I would say that I may not answer your question, Nathan, but I saw Jeff Bezos speak recently, and he said that companies like Amazon and, quite frankly, Google and everybody else are able to build businesses that in the last 20 years are now some of the largest companies in the world, because there has been shoulders of giants and infrastructure spending in the hundreds of billions of dollars, in Amazon's case, logistics, and in other digital companies' cases, the internet. And my view is that you have to invest in these infrastructure for the future, otherwise there won't be the next Amazon or Facebook or Yahoo or whatever. So maybe private sector, people like Jeff or somebody can invest heavily in infrastructure going forward, but I do worry that our country is not investing enough for the future in terms of these kinds of infrastructure. It could be God knows what. It doesn't have to be the internet. Yes, it came from defense, but it could have easily come from somewhere else, because communicating between entities is extremely important. I was talking to somebody, running a tech company these days is much more difficult. And I know I see Marissa in the audience as well. And it's not easy to have a conversation about government, especially post, sort of Snowden era. The reality is most of these companies like Google have more employees outside the U.S. probably, more revenues outside the U.S., Apple and everybody else is the same. And so they're really global companies, international companies. Yes, they have to live and abide by the U.S. law. Ultimately, I think the American system is still the best system, but it isn't without its flaws. And I think the beauty about companies that are global and American systems is you can have these debates. I don't think they're having these kind of debates in Russia or China.
Yeah, and so for those of you in on the inside joke, we can talk about it later. Jerry just agreed with my position on that.
Alan, I agree with you too,
yeah.
wherever you are.
You don't want to get in between us, I know. Go ahead, right there, please.
Ashu from Foundation Capital. Jerry, you made the comment when, about the startup culture in China, that when people come to work, you're with your family, and when you go home, you're with your other family, and that's less important.
I was joking.
Sort of joking.
Yeah.
But those companies are increasingly global competitors for startups in the US. And what does that really mean for the culture of companies that we're all funding here in the US, which don't necessarily have the same culture?
Yeah, are the Chinese companies unbeatable is what he's saying?
I think it's very different, right? I mean, at the end of the day, I advocate a better balance in life for creative, innovative industries. I think if you're ultimately dependent on your creativity and innovation to advance, having a balanced approach is much better over the long term. And I don't know if I want to, if I can quote our guest from Yunnan province from China who just said to me, he says, this is great. You guys Americans have this holiday mentality where you guys can gather for the summer holidays and create this conference and gather. In China, even the government officials work all the time. They don't really have this holiday mentality, so they can't gather. And I think part of it is this idea that being industrious and being together all the time is going to create tighter bond. They're gonna fight through obstacles. Whereas I think in the U.S., the innovation-based industries does require sort of this sponge, right? You squeeze and then you relax, and you squeeze and relax. I just think it's very different ways of approaching challenges and solutions. It remains to be seen which system is going to be better, and quite frankly, in the oncoming age of AI, I really do think relying on innovation and creativity is going to be the value add for human beings, and so I like the life of balance better, but clearly that's still something that needs to be defined and evolving.
And I'll just ask you a short question to finish, which is, you're following the Chinese policy on AI. We have robust efforts on AI. I should say, the U.S. has robust efforts.
We do?
Do you see a winner, or is that too simplistic?
And there's now way too many literature being written on it, and it's hard to know. But I would say this: I think that ultimately, what everybody's worried about is AGI, the general intelligence, where more cognition and more learning is happening, more human-like learning is happening, and in that case, what these machines and algorithms will learn is what humans put into them. So today it's data, tomorrow's models. Eventually, it's our value system, it's our culture, it's what we believe in, what we don't believe in, what we think is right, and what we think is wrong. As we know, between cultures, there's disagreement about that. The Chinese culture may think one way to do things is right, and what we in the US think is another way. And just think that being inputted into these intelligent machines that are going to scale that belief and scale those cultures. And so I think there needs to be more global dialogue around how to resolve these scaled cultural differences once machines are able to be cognitive. And today, to use it for surveillance or not to use it for surveillance, I think it's a cultural divide. But just imagine that times a million.
Well, Jerry, I think what all of us have been able to see tonight, and I think it's so fun to see, is the balance that you've found in your life, and it's really admirable and nice. And thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks.